You feel things other people don't seem to notice. The texture of a room when something is off. The shift in someone's tone before they've said anything significant. The accumulation of a long day in a way that lands differently for you than it does for the people around you. You've been called too sensitive, told to toughen up, advised to stop taking things so personally. And you've spent years not knowing what to do with that, because the sensitivity doesn't feel like a choice. It doesn't feel like a way of being that you could simply decide to stop. It feels like the way the world arrives, louder, more detailed, more saturated with meaning than other people seem to experience it. Here's what that actually is. Not weakness, not neurosis, not the product of a difficult childhood, though childhood can shape how it expresses. It is a documented biological trait, one that appears in approximately 15 to 20% of the human population, that has been found in more than 100 other species, and that has a specific neurological basis that researchers have been mapping for 30 years. And once you understand it, not just that it exists, but what it actually is and why it exists, you'll never think about your own sensitivity the same way again. There is a researcher named Elaine Aron. She is a psychologist who, in 1991, identified and began studying a trait she called sensory processing sensitivity, now more commonly known as the trait of the highly sensitive person, or HSP. Aron's research began, in part, with her own experience. She had always been aware that she processed the world differently from most people around her, more deeply, more intensely, more affected by subtleties that others seemed not to register. When she began reviewing the psychological literature, she found scattered references to related constructs, introversion, inhibitedness, reactivity, but no coherent framework for the specific combination of characteristics she was observing. She developed one. The trait of sensory processing sensitivity, as Aron defined it, has 4 core components. She uses the acronym D.O.E.S to describe them. D. Depth of processing. Highly sensitive people process information at a deeper level than average. They are more likely to make connections, to notice implications, to consider multiple angles before responding or acting. O. Overstimulation. Because they process more deeply, they are also more easily overwhelmed by intense stimulation, crowded environments, loud noise, time pressure, multiple simultaneous demands. Emotional reactivity and empathy. Highly sensitive people have stronger emotional responses to both positive and negative stimuli, and a more acute ability to read and respond to the emotional states of others. S. Sensitivity to subtleties. They notice details, sensory, social, emotional, that others miss. They are attuned to nuance in a way that can be both a gift and a burden. These 4 characteristics, Aron found, consistently cluster together in the same individuals. They are not 4 separate traits, but 4 expressions of a single underlying biological difference in how the nervous system processes information. Here is the neuroscience. The highly sensitive nervous system does not simply receive more input, it processes existing input more thoroughly. Research using fMRI imaging has found that the brains of people with high sensory processing sensitivity show greater activation in regions associated with attention, action planning, and integration of sensory information when presented with both neutral and emotionally significant stimuli. Specifically, the mirror neuron system, associated with empathy and social cognition, shows heightened activation. The insula, involved in self-awareness and the processing of bodily and emotional states, shows heightened activation. Areas associated with depth of processing, regions that connect incoming sensory data to existing knowledge structures and emotional memories, show heightened activation. The highly sensitive brain is not registering more input. It is doing more with the input it receives, more connections, more cross-referencing, more integration of current experience with emotional memory and social context, which produces a richer, more detailed, more layered experience of each moment, and a correspondingly higher processing load. A 2014 neuroimaging study by researchers, including Bianca Acevedo at the University of California, Santa Barbara, showed that HSPs showed stronger activation of brain regions associated with awareness, integration of sensory information, and empathic responses when viewing photographs of people displaying emotional expressions. Neutral faces activated more, positive emotional expressions activated more, negative emotional expressions activated significantly more, with activation patterns distinct from those seen in people with mood disorders, pointing to a trait-level difference in processing rather than a pathological one. The highly sensitive brain is more activated by the same stimuli, not more distressed, more engaged. The distinction matters. Here is the finding that most people have never heard about sensory processing sensitivity. It appears in other species, not occasionally, consistently, across more than 100 species studied, including fruit flies, fish, birds, and other mammals. The evolutionary biologist David Sloan Wilson at Binghamton University, studying this phenomenon across species, found that in many animal populations, a minority, typically 15 to 20%, show a behavioral phenotype characterized by greater sensitivity to environmental cues, more careful assessment before action, more pronounced responses to both positive and negative experiences. This minority coexists consistently with a majority that is less sensitive, bolder, faster to act, less attuned to nuance. The persistence of both across evolutionary time, the fact that natural selection has not eliminated either, is itself significant. Both strategies offer survival advantages under different conditions. In stable environments with known resources and few novel threats, the bolder, less sensitive strategy is more efficient, less processing overhead, faster action, greater resource acquisition. In unpredictable environments with novel threats and opportunities, the more sensitive strategy offers an advantage. Better detection of subtle changes, earlier identification of dangers, more accurate reading of social dynamics that determines group cohesion and cooperation. Neither is universally superior. Both have been maintained because environmental conditions vary, across time, across geography, across the specific challenges a population faces. Wilson and colleagues proposed that the sensitive minority serves a specific ecological function. They are the early warning system of the group, the ones most likely to detect a subtle change in the environment before the change becomes obvious, the ones whose heightened processing produces the first signal that something is different, that something may require attention. The trait did not persist in the gene pool by accident. It persisted because the group that had it survived better than the group that didn't. Here is where the research gets specific about what the highly sensitive experience actually feels like from the inside, and why the cultural framing of sensitivity as weakness is so precisely backwards. Aron's research found that HSPs are not uniformly negatively affected by their trait. They are differentially affected by environmental conditions. In positive, supportive, low-threat environments, HSPs show measurably greater gains than non-HSPs from the same positive conditions. They extract more benefit from good circumstances, respond more fully to beauty, to kindness, to meaningful work, to genuine connection, experience positive emotions with greater intensity. In negative, threatening, high-stress environments, HSPs show measurably greater losses than non-HSPs from the same adverse conditions. They are more affected by chaos, by conflict, by environments that do not support their need for depth and quiet processing. This pattern, more affected by both positive and negative conditions than the average, is called differential susceptibility, and it was formalized by developmental psychologist Jay Belsky at the University of California, Davis. Belsky describes highly sensitive individuals as having a higher biological sensitivity to context, not more fragile, more responsive, to everything, in both directions, The same nervous system that makes difficult environments particularly costly also makes good environments particularly rewarding. The framing of sensitivity as weakness is a framing based on an environment, modern Western professional culture, that happens to be unusually high stimulation, high pace, and poorly suited to deep processing. It is not an evaluation of the trait itself. It is an evaluation of how one trait performs in one specific, historically unusual set of conditions. Move the sensitive person into a different environment, one that values depth, nuance, careful consideration, attunement to others, and the calculation reverses entirely. Here is the pattern that Aron's research found across professions, across cultures, and across history. Highly sensitive people are disproportionately represented in certain roles, not because they sought those roles specifically, because their trait is directly relevant to the skills those roles require. Therapists and counselors, professionals who rely on the ability to read emotional states accurately, to notice what is not being said, to attune to the subtle communications of another person's inner experience, show elevated rates of sensory processing sensitivity. Artists, writers, musicians, people whose work depends on the ability to notice and communicate the texture of experience with greater precision than most, show elevated rates. Scientists and researchers, particularly in fields requiring sustained attention to subtle patterns in data, show elevated rates. Spiritual and religious leaders, in traditions across cultures, have often been drawn from populations showing characteristics consistent with high sensitivity. The prophetic, oracular, and contemplative roles in many traditions are filled by people whose attuned processing of the world's subtleties produces insights that others did not reach through more direct routes. The highly sensitive person is not a modern phenomenon of a society that has made people soft. They appear in every documented human culture, in every historical period, in a consistent proportion of the population. They appear to have been selected by evolution not despite their sensitivity, but because of what their sensitivity contributes to the group's ability to notice what is coming before it arrives, to the community's capacity for empathy, for art, for the deep processing of meaning that distinguishes human cultures from other social species. There is a specific challenge that most highly sensitive people face that the research addresses with unusual directness: the comparison problem. Because 80 to 85% of the population is not highly sensitive, the highly sensitive person grows up surrounded primarily by people whose experience of the world is genuinely different, who do not find crowded environments as draining, who do not feel the emotional register of a room as acutely, who do not need the same amount of quiet, of downtime, of unstructured processing time to maintain equilibrium. And the highly sensitive person, not understanding that their trait is biological rather than chosen, often measures their own experience against the experience of the majority. Why does this affect me more than it affects everyone else? Why do I need more time to recover from a difficult week? Why does conflict feel so much more intense to me than it seems to for other people? The answer most highly sensitive people arrive at, in the absence of the framework the research provides, is a self-critical one. Something is wrong with me. I am too much. I need to become more like the people who don't struggle with this. The research suggests the opposite conclusion: not that you are too much, that you are different in a specific, documented, evolutionarily significant way, and that the appropriate response is not to try to reduce the sensitivity, which is a biological trait and not meaningfully subject to voluntary reduction, but to build the conditions that allow the trait to operate as the asset it was designed to be: more downtime than the average person requires, not as a luxury, as a biological necessity, more intentional management of overstimulating environments, not as avoidance, as optimization, more relationships characterized by depth rather than breadth, not because width is wrong, Because depth is where the highly sensitive person's relational gifts are most fully engaged. There is a final piece of the research that connects the highly sensitive trait to something broader about human potential. Aron's research, and subsequent work building on it, has found that highly sensitive people who understand their trait and have built lives compatible with it consistently show high levels of creativity, empathy, and depth of experience. They are not simply people who feel more. They are people who, given the right conditions, contribute in ways that their trait specifically enables. The therapist who catches what others miss. The artist whose work captures something true about human experience that more surface-level observation could not access. The researcher who notices the pattern in the data that others walked past. The friend who understands without being told. These contributions are not incidental to the trait. They are the trait, expressed in conditions that allow its advantages to operate without being overwhelmed by its costs. The highly sensitive person in a poorly suited environment looks like someone who can't handle the world. The highly sensitive person in a well-suited environment looks like someone who understands it better than most. Same trait, different conditions. You feel things other people don't seem to notice. That's where we started. And now you know what that is. Not a flaw to be corrected. A trait to be understood. One that has been part of human populations since before recorded history. That appears in more than 100 other species. That serves a function in every community that has it. That offers specific, documented advantages when the conditions allow those advantages to emerge. The sensitivity is not the problem. The mismatch between the sensitivity and the environment has been the problem, and mismatches, unlike traits, can be addressed. Not by changing who you are, by changing what you ask your nervous system to do, and what you build around it so that it has the space it was always designed to need. If the science behind how different nervous systems experience the world matters to you, the real research, explained without the noise, subscribe. No pathologizing sensitivity, no pressure to be different than you are, just the biology and psychology that holds up, and what it means for how you understand yourself. The next video goes into why introverts and highly sensitive people are not the same thing, and what the research says about the specific differences between two traits that are constantly confused. Hit subscribe. That one is worth staying for. There is a specific finding from the Differential susceptibility research that changes how highly sensitive people understand their own history. It concerns childhood. Jay Belsky's research on differential susceptibility found that highly sensitive children are more affected by the quality of their early environment than less sensitive children, in both directions. Highly sensitive children raised in warm, responsive, supportive environments show outcomes that exceed even what those environments produce in less sensitive children. They develop greater empathy, greater social competence, greater capacity for emotional regulation, and often greater creative ability than their less sensitive peers raised in the same conditions. Highly sensitive children raised in harsh, neglectful, or inconsistent environments show worse outcomes than less sensitive children raised in the same conditions. The sensitivity that would have been an asset in a supportive environment becomes a liability in an adverse one. This finding, sometimes called the Orchid and Dandelion hypothesis, was developed by psychologist W. Thomas Boyce at the University of California, San Francisco. Dandelion children, less sensitive children, grow reasonably well under most conditions. They are resilient to a wider range of environments. They do not need ideal conditions to develop adequately. Orchid children, highly sensitive children, are more dependent on conditions. In poor soil, they fail to thrive. In good soil, they produce something extraordinary. What this means for highly sensitive adults who had difficult childhoods is significant. The specific ways in which a difficult childhood affected you, the hypervigilance, the difficulty with transitions, the intensity of your responses to conflict or criticism were not simply the effects of the difficulty itself. They were the effects of difficulty interacting with a nervous system that was always going to be more affected by its environment than the average. You did not simply have a hard time. You had a hard time in the specific way that a highly sensitive nervous system has a hard time, more intensely, more persistently, with greater difficulty returning to baseline. And by the same logic, the experiences that helped, the moments of genuine safety, of being understood, of an environment that was calm enough for your nervous system to fully settle, had more impact on you than they would have had on a less sensitive child. The good things went deeper, too. Not just the hard things. The entire range of experience registers more fully in a highly sensitive nervous system, which means both that the difficult parts of your history may require more intentional processing than they would for someone less sensitive, and that the good parts, the beauty, the connection, the meaning, the moments of genuine aliveness, are available to you with an intensity that most people never access. The same system, the same depth, available for both. There is one more piece of the research that deserves direct attention before this ends, because it addresses the question that most highly sensitive people eventually ask, in some form or another. Is there something I can do about this? Not to eliminate it, that question has already been answered, but to live better within it? The research is consistent on several specific points. The first is what Aron calls environmental control, not the elimination of stimulation, but the management of it. The recognition that the highly sensitive nervous system operates best when it is not chronically overloaded, and that building adequate recovery time, adequate quiet, adequate space between demanding inputs is not a luxury, but a maintenance requirement of a specific kind of nervous system. Not self-indulgence, optimization. The second is what researchers studying sensory processing sensitivity consistently describe as the importance of meaning. Highly sensitive people perform and feel better in situations they find meaningful than in situations that feel arbitrary or purposeless. The depth of processing that makes intense stimulation costly also makes the experience of genuine purpose unusually sustaining. Not the appearance of meaning, actual engagement with work, relationships, or activities that the person genuinely cares about. For a less sensitive person, meaningless work is boring or somewhat unpleasant. For a highly sensitive person, meaningless work is significantly more draining, because the depth of processing that characterizes the trait continues operating even when the content being processed offers no return. The same depth that produces richness in meaningful contexts produces a specific kind of depletion when applied to content that offers none. The third, and the one the research most consistently identifies as transformative, is understanding the trait itself. Aron's research found that highly sensitive people who understood their trait, who knew its name, its biological basis, and its distribution in the population, showed measurably better psychological outcomes than those who did not. Not because the knowledge changed anything about the nervous system, because it changed what the nervous system meant. The sensitivity that was previously evidence of weakness, of being too much, of failing to cope the way others cope, became, in the light of the research, evidence of a different kind of biological architecture, one that processes more deeply, that notices more, that is affected more, that, in the right conditions, produces more. Understanding the trait does not change it, it changes the relationship to it. And that relationship, how you hold what you are, what story you tell about it, what it means about your place in a world that mostly wasn't designed for you, is the difference between a highly sensitive life that is organized around the limits of the trait and one that is organized around its possibilities.